friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time, and I'm here today to talk about dehydrating cabbage and the ways that you can use it. So I have dehydrated cabbage before, and this one's actually 2-3 years old now, where I dehydrated up a bunch of red cabbage because I wasn't going to use it right away, but I keep forgetting I have it. And I've already decided what I'm going to do next with this, but I'll get to that in a little bit. All these are jars of dehydrated cabbage. This was from the last batch, and this is the batch I just did. As far as dehydrating goes, it's super simple. I did try using my wood stove rack next to the wood stove, but unfortunately, after 24 hours, they still had barely even started to dry. So then I went ahead and stuck them in my regular dehydrator. Now, all I did was just chop it up. You can chop it any size you want. The previous batch I chopped them a little bit smaller than I did this last one, but you can't really tell. And the only reason I cut them up so small the first time was I was afraid they wouldn't dehydrate well, but in the dehydrator they did beautifully. Anyway, so I chop it up. This last one I did a lot of 1-inch size pieces and some a little bit bigger. And in my dehydrator, I always use cloth covers over my trays. That keeps the teeny tiny pieces from falling through and just holds everything in and then makes it much easier to deal with. When I'm doing fruits, vegetables, eggs, milk, I never put it above 115 degrees. I go lower only for herbs. And if I'm going to go higher, it would only be because I was doing meat. My dehydrator actually is automatically set at 18 hours. I would recommend checking it after 10. And then again at 12. Since it's just automatically set at 18 hours because that's what I have it set at. Because I'm afraid I'll forget about it if it's running through the night and it shuts off then the next morning. Sometimes if dehydrated things sit in your dehydrator for too long without you dealing with them, they can start absorbing the moisture from the air. So if you live in a place that has a lot of humidity like we do, then you'd have to run the dehydrator again anyway. So I just want to make sure it's going to run until I'm ready to deal with it. And as long as it's a low heat like that, it's not going to burn it. And they were perfect this morning when I got up. They were totally dry. What you need to do if they're still warm is you need to let them cool down a bit so you can check and make sure that they're crunchy. So let me take this jar that I haven't sealed yet. So for example, here's this jar. I can still break it up. It's very dry. But when I first pulled it out of the dehydrator, it felt flexible because it was still very warm. So let it get to room temperature and then check it. Then if it still feels flexible, put it back into the dehydrator for a couple more hours and then just keep checking it after that. Now, since I used the cloth covers, I simply just pick the corners of the cloth up and then just dump it right into my jar like that. It works pretty good. And then I vacuum seal. So this jar I did leave unsealed so I can show you how I do that. Now, I do recommend you vacuum seal your cabbage and various other dried goods because some things have a tendency, as I mentioned, they can become stale if you don't have them in an airtight container. Now, some people will use oxygen absorbers, but I never use oxygen absorbers for anything because to me it's a waste of money, especially when you can just invest for about the same price as you would for a good sized pack of quality oxygen absorbers. You can get yourself a brake bleeder pump and a set of Food Saver or even an off-brand set of the tops. Or you can even get the set that comes with its own pump. I prefer the brake bleeder pump. I do have that other set, and I'll link down below to the video I did on various ways to vacuum seal. This still is my favorite method. So using a brake bleeder pump that you find in automotive, and I'll put a link to one down below, I just insert one of the tips into the top of the Food Saver or whatever top I'm using, and then I just pump it up until the gauge is at least going straight up to where it says 15 or 400. Then I go past that. I try to go actually up to about 20 or 500, or at least keep pumping until that needle just stops moving altogether. And then pull the top off, and then I'll check, especially since I always use recycled lids when I'm doing this, the metal lids. I pick it up by the lid to make sure that it stays sealed. Then, in this case, dried goods, put your band in place snugly. You don't have to crank it on super tight. just put it on snug, because that's going to hold the lid in place in case you lose a seal. And especially, like I mentioned in other videos, if you go to grab it and you don't have the band holding the lid in place and it came unsealed and you didn't know it, you could have quite a mess all over the place. And then just make sure that you label it. And then these will go back in the long-term storage. Now this is my batch. This is from the previous batch I did. And then people will ask, well, how long is all that going to last? Well, I always say, when it comes to canned, home-dried foods, they can last indefinitely. It's really about how you store them. So if you're vacuum sealing your dried goods, that's going to prolong the freshness of it. So it's not that these foods spoil. It's that your dried goods can just lose their nutrient value over time. And this applies to freeze-dried foods, especially if you're storing in jars where they're exposed to light and you're not vacuum sealing it. They'll lose nutrient value over time and they'll lose quality, but they never spoil unless they get wet on the inside. And then home canned goods, the only time they'll spoil is if they lose a seal. So other than that, they should last indefinitely, despite what some people say. But now let's talk about how you can use your cabbage. So one of the things I did, I was really excited to try, especially since I've been doing making vinegars out of dried goods. I thought, well, why not try using my dried cabbage for making a batch of kimchi and see how that works? So in that case, I thought, well, since I'm using dried cabbage, let me just go ahead and use all dried goods. I took a pint jar, which is half of a quart, and I dumped that into a quart-sized jar. So then to that, I added some carrots, and that's going to be totally optional. I added some dried onions. I added some dried garlic. I added some cayenne pepper. Then I put in the fermentation starter, topped it off with water. And you can see in this picture right here, with the water in there, you can tell the dried goods only fill up about half the jar. But by the next morning, the cabbage and the other dried goods had already taken up quite a bit of the space and absorbed a lot of that water. And then I let it ferment for 3 days, and it turned out quite good. I was impressed. I was afraid the cabbage would get real soggy. When I eat kimchi, I prefer it to have a crunch to it. Even though it was dried and then rehydrated, it had a crunch to it that reminds me more of fresh cabbage. And so I'm really happy with this. Now, if you want more information on how I make kimchi without using a brine, which I used to do years ago, many years ago when I first started making kimchi, I'm thinking like over 20 years ago. And I did it the traditional way with the brine and letting it sit for up to 2 weeks. But now I do a fermentation starter that I make myself and then let it sit for 3 to 5 days. Just depending on how it's coming along. Sometimes some ferments can take longer, but also depending on how I want it to taste. So it will get very fizzy and it just is wonderful. I love it. So anyway, you can check out that recipe. I'll put in the description box down below. And so that will apply whether you're using dried goods or fresh goods. In the video, I'm using fresh goods. So with that said, one of my 2 favorite kimchis is actually red cabbage kimchi. Not only does it make a beautiful color, but there's something about the red cabbage that there's just an added flavor it gives to the kimchi, and I prefer it now over the regular green cabbage or Napa cabbage, which is commonly what is used, also known as Chinese cabbage, and also bok choy. Bok choy is also quite good too, but love the red cabbage kimchi. My other favorite is, I tried last year and I made a cucumber kimchi from some of my excess cucumbers, and boy was that good. And I'll be doing a separate video on making cucumber kimchi, because there's some added ingredient you got to use in there with the cucumbers to help it hold its crunch, and it actually worked. So I'll be doing that video once we have cucumbers. So definitely growing them again this year. So anyway, that's what I'm going to do with the red cabbage. But the other thing you can do with either the green or the red is you can powder it up and add it to stuff. Now the red cabbage, when you powder it up, it makes a nice purple colored powder that you can then use as a food coloring if you want to add coloring to anything that you're making. And I haven't really used it for food coloring, but I experimented by adding it to just a glass of water, and you'll see in this picture, and you can see the lovely color it added to the water when I did that. But you could also use the red cabbage powder to make your own like lip color. So if you're making your own lip balm, then just add a little bit of that to the lip balm. Make sure it's powdered really fine though, and it'll add a beautiful color to your lip balm if you like that kind of color. Another thing I tried the dried cabbage in was to I have some organic ramen noodles that I was finally able to find. And so every once in a while for lunch, I like to make myself some ramen. These don't have seasoning packs because I didn't want them anyway. I like making my own seasoning by using my own bone broth, some garlic, whatever it is I feel like adding. So the last time I made the ramen, I went ahead and put the dried cabbage right in there with the other spices and the noodles, and then added the water and then just cooked that. And it turned out really, really good. I think I'm probably going to be adding the cabbage every time now that I make that ramen for lunch, or even if I make a big batch of it for dinner. But anyway, really good in that. So obviously adding the cabbage to soups, this is what I do with most of my dried vegetables, is they get thrown into soups. It's such an easy way to whip up a soup. Maybe you've already got some bone broth you just made up after you finished off a turkey, a chicken, and then took the bones and made some broth. Take some or all of that broth, make a big pot of soup, and just throw a whole bunch of dehydrated vegetables in there with it. So your carrots, your cabbage, your dried green beans, your dried peas, your dried snow peas, those things all dry up beautifully. I've done those. I've dried both homegrown snow peas and green beans, and those work really great in soups or any other dried thing you want to add to it. Easy way to whip up some soup. But the other thing is, so then how do you go about, if you're wanting to use it in a stir fry where you're not already cooking it in a liquid like you do with soup or the ramen that I made, or even the kimchi where it's already soaking in the water for several days? Well, in that case, when you're doing dried goods, it's best to if you're wanting to do a stir fry of some kind, like tonight I'm going to make chicken fried rice because I have some leftover chicken. Then I'm going to just put whatever looks good to me of the vegetable into a bowl. And since I'm already doing this, I'll go ahead and use dried carrots. Usually I'll use fresh ones when I'm doing this, but since I'm doing this already, I'll sprinkle in a bunch of dried carrots. Then what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to rehydrate them and just let them sit. So you're going to be soaking them in water until you're ready to actually use them, and then you're going to strain off the water. But what I'm going to do here is, instead of just using plain water, I'm going to add, since this is going to be more of an Asian flair to it, I'm going to add a little bit of Bragg's liquid aminos in here. You can also use coconut aminos if you prefer that. They do have a sweeter flavor. And then I'm also going to add some of my homemade wine, because a lot of times when I'm doing any kind of stir fry or cooking, things like that, I like to use a little bit of homemade wine. It's one of the reasons I keep homemade wine on hand all the time, is for making medicinal extracts and also for cooking with. That's already some liquid that's going to add flavor to that. Then I'm going to go ahead and add some water to that. And the reason this water is in a jug is because we collect and filter our own rainwater. And so I keep a lot of it in jugs and I switch them out every day. Okay, now I'm going to stir that. And you might need to come back and stir it every so often just to make sure that everything's getting covered in the liquid and is soaking it up. And then I'll just leave that until I'm ready to use it. And if it hasn't soaked up all the liquid, then I'll just strain it out. Or if there's just a little bit of liquid in there, I may still use that and add that into the rice and the other things that I'm using in there. I'm going to go ahead and open up this jar of red cabbage and throw a few pieces of that in for color. And I did open this up so I could check the crispiness of it, because it's been sitting back there for a few years. That's going to add a little more color to it. So I'll have a little bit of purple in there as well. The purple cabbage is going to end up turning all the liquid purple, which will probably color the green cabbage. But anyway, you can see how that looks right there, right now. Anyway, so we'll let that soak, and if you feel like it needs any more liquid, and some other ideas that you can soak it into, especially if you're vegan, is you can use a vegetable broth instead of water. When the vegetables are rehydrating, they'll just soak in all that flavor directly into it instead of just soaking up plain unflavored water. Now, while I do still love to pressure can and water bath can things like peaches and jams, green beans from my garden, and homemade chili, and soups and meatballs, I am finding more and more I'm starting to lean towards dehydrating for a lot of things like vegetables, because not only do they still have a multiple amount of uses, they take up far less space in food storage than freezing or canning or even freeze drying, because freeze dried foods take up almost as much room as fresh foods do, because they don't shrink down the way dehydrated foods do. The fruits are really good though, but generally speaking, I prefer dehydrated, especially when you're talking vegetables, over freeze dried by far. So that's just my personal choice. And anyway, as easy as this is, I just highly recommend it. So if you're growing cabbage this year and you're getting more than what you know what to do with, you're tired of making coleslaw or sauerkraut or even kimchi, consider dehydrating it up for its many uses throughout the year. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this video and it gave you a few more ideas and any other suggestions what you would do with your dried cabbage. And yes, I would assume you could make sauerkraut with it too. So give it a try and let me know. All right, well, thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.